Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So this week we are talking about Swift.
That lovely language introduced about a year and a half ago now? 2 years ago?
Yeah, almost a year and a half, yeah.
If I have a brief confession to make, I've never written a single line of Swift in the last year and a half. Not a single one.
I think I can say the same thing as long as playgrounds don't count. I wrote a few lines in a playground once, and that was it. Beyond that, I certainly have written no Swift code that's gone into an app. Yeah,
and I gotta say, I almost feel guilty when I say that. Like, it's this thing that feels like, I'm a fairly committed Apple platform person. Like, I do a lot of development here. This is where I make my livelihood, and this is their whole big fancy new thing. That has, in theory, a variety of advantages to the way that I've developed things in Objective-C, but I've never really felt motivated to learn Swift. I think that's because I don't see how it would make my apps as they are today any better. And that's kind of a strange place to find myself, that I think my apps would be just the same using Objective-C that I know so well. But there's always in the back of my mind, like, I should be learning Swift. That would probably be better. But that's never happened.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. It's something that I'm not really against it. I mean, there are some things about it I don't care for, but I'm sure I'd get over them, in practice once I was using the language full time. And I'm sure there will come a time where we will switch to it and we will start using it full time, and it will just be normal and we'll just deal with it. But I don't think the time has yet come where you need to switch to it if you already have a code base in Objective-C that doesn't really need to be migrated for any particular reason, or if you already have a lot of Objective-C knowledge, and your primary goal is to ship apps quickly and with little overhead, then in those cases, I think it does make sense to do what we're doing so far and just wait and see. It's not that Swift is never going to be a part of our lives. It's just that I don't think there's a lot of compelling reasons for us to adopt it yet. When we already have this experience and wisdom and tool chains and everything, all these things, everything's built up around the other language that we've known forever.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was also in preparation thinking about today's episode. I was thinking too, what are the reasons why I haven't? And there's obviously like the obvious ones of just like the inertia of having done Objective-C for so long and knowing it like inside and out, knowing where all the like the quirks are and all the problems. And when I hit a weird bug, I'm pretty good at finding them in Objective-C if they're, programming related rather than logically related. But the thing that also makes me so nervous about Swift is that it keeps changing. Like, every time a new version of Xcode comes out, it seems like there's some new thing in Swift. There's some new syntax, there's some new ability, there's some new approach for the way it works. And every time I see one of those, I think it's like I have this moment of relief that, wow, I'm glad I haven't decided to start learning Swift yet. Because it seems like what I would have learned every time is constantly being like deprecated going forward. And that makes me so nervous about spending the time, because the reality is like I have so little time to invest into new things that aren't just like actually working, that spending time on something that potentially could be completely overcome by, or not completely is probably an extreme, but could require me to go back and change the things that I've learned or change the code that I've written, is very discouraging.
Yeah, because it seems like churn to go through this process, and to some degree, certain things like this are necessary in our profession. When Apple changes the UI of the entire OS, like with iOS 7, and we have to recreate or redo or reimplement a lot of things that we had already done. Like, it never feels great to be forced to repeat work, or to be forced to throw away something that works perfectly well just to do it some new way that you didn't really want to do. On the flip side of that, a lot of people, and myself included, I love deleting code that is no longer necessary, or like once there's a new ability to do something, like a new API comes out from Apple in a new OS release that makes a whole bunch of my code obsolete. I love deleting that old code and getting rid of it, getting it out of my life, and moving on, using the new Apple API, assuming it works, which isn't always the case, but usually, and having less code to manage. So like that part is nice. A lot of programmers, myself included, also frequently get the itch to rewrite things in a better way. And that sometimes that is a good idea. It often isn't. Sometimes it's just a big waste of time and a way to create all your bugs all over again. But sometimes it is a good idea. But I think with Swift coming in for Objective-C programmers, the motivation is less there. And as you said, it is still changing a lot. For most of its first year, the tools were still really immature, and we're still having lots of crashing and performance issues. And that seems to be resolved so far from people who have written Swift so far, who are really into it more than us. It does seem like I've been kind of like paying attention to what people say about it. How people report, like, oh, we converted a big project, or we started a new project in Swift, and here's how it went for us. And in the early days, those stories were really rough. In the early days, they were really not compelling because everything was still so immature and unstable. As time has gone on, in just a year and a half, which is pretty quick, that has settled somewhat, and a lot of people are now saying, okay, now you can jump in. I've done a project in Swift, and it was fine for us. So I think now would be a safe enough time to jump in, and it wouldn't be too unreasonable. But again, it comes back to, how do we allocate our limited time and our limited resources, and how much time are we willing to devote to messing with something that's still new and immature, and adapting to it as it changes. Like, to me, like I've always said in the past, and we'll talk about server-side stuff, I'm sure, many times, but I've always said in the past that my server-side stuff I want to be very conservative with, especially as you get lower down the application level stack. So if you want to try out a new, web API, cool, whatever, a new application layer thing, as you go down the stack, I don't want to be running a cutting-edge Linux distribution. I want to be running a very conservative OS. I want to be running a very conservative database. As you get that low level with the data layer and the infrastructure layer of these things, I don't want to be on the cutting edge of anything there, because the cutting edge is where you get bugs and instability and you hit limitations. As you move up the stack, I feel like you have more tolerance for things like that, for risk in those areas. For me, the programming language that you're writing your code in is pretty low level. And with Swift, you at least have the benefit of you can mix it in slowly. And that was very wise of Apple to do. There are some downsides to things like they couldn't make as clean of a jump as they might have wanted to, because they had to maintain backwards compatibility with Objective-C libraries and stuff. But for the most part, I think that was wise, because we can kind of wade in slowly when we decide that's the right move. But at the same time, because of my conservatism in those low-level things, I don't really see a huge reason to jump in yet, because I don't want to be programming with a cutting-edge language. And not only for instability reasons and for having to relearn things as they change things over time. Not only for those reasons, but also, right now, we don't really know what will eventually be known as idiomatic Swift and idiomatic Swift API design. We don't know those things yet. Those are still being worked out. A lot of people, and I'm not one, and I don't think you are one either, a lot of people love being a part of that process of figuring out what the idioms should be and helping to create them and helping to work out how things, and helping to experiment with, maybe we should design APIs in this way, maybe the right way to use the language is this. I am not into that at all. For me, I would rather let the smarter people than me, who care a lot more about language design and who are better at it than I am, let them figure out the idioms and the language design and the API design, and then I want to just take the finished product and master one thing that they've figured out over time and apply that into building apps that I want. So it's I want to be closer to the product building side, not the messing with languages side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the process of it sounds vaguely interesting, sort of let's be part of the process, and it seems like the Swift team is very responsive, and that all those side things on that side seem to be very encouraging in that regard, if that were something you were interested in. But it's just effort going into something that isn't making my apps better, isn't making my customers happier, isn't helping me ship something more impressive. It's it's going into something that is kind of intellectually cool, but it kind of feels, it's the difference between someone who is an academic versus who has makes a more practical living. I'm very glad there are people who enjoy that more academic side of computer science, who come up with the new things and push boundaries and go down 10 sort of dead end roads before they find the thing that is actually the thing that we're going to want to use in practice. I'm really glad those people exist. but it's a very different thing than with the skills and the experience and the time allocation that you would want to do if you actually have to ship something. And ultimately, especially if that thing that you ship at the end of the day has to like make your living, then the last thing you want to be doing is playing around with stuff that isn't quite baked or isn't quite to the point that this is exactly the way you do it. Because I think in Objective-C, it's very established at this point. It's an old enough language, and its use has been so focused in by Apple and has benefited from the fact that I think Apple is the only people who sort of typically use it in a way that like language like Java or C has so many different uses that it doesn't quite have that same heavy hand that Apple, I think, has been able to bring to it, where as they've improved and changed the syntax and the details of Objective-C, like it is now very finely tuned to go along with Cocoa and to go along with iOS and to go along with all of the things that go into building for Apple's platforms, that it's very straightforward. Like there is probably one way to write most functions and most code. And once you learn it and once you get good at it, then you know you're doing the right thing. And the process of learning that for Swift just sounds like kind of scary until that thing settles down. And so I'm not really sure what's ultimately going to get me to learn Swift. Like I was thinking about it, what could Apple do? Like obviously they're doing all the right things on the marketing side of saying like, this is the hot new thing. All their sample code is or most of their sample code is in Swift. At WWDC, all the session videos, all the code on the slides is in Swift. Like they're pushing it as hard as they can from a marketing perspective. But my gut says until they come out with something that says you can only interact with this platform or interact with this library in Swift, I probably won't learn it. That's just the practical reality. Like I'd almost wondered if when they were announcing things like the watch or the TV, if at some point they would say this is a Swift only platform and architect like the runtime for it or the libraries for it or those types of things in such a way that say like this is the only language that it's going to work. And if they did that, obviously, like I'd have to learn. I mean, it's sort of like with the tvOS where you can write apps natively or in the TVML like markup language. If they had said, "Oh, we're only going to do the TVML stuff," then like okay, if I wanted to do a TV app, I would have learned that. But it seems like it's probably only going to come out of necessity rather than out of just like the intrinsic desire.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at some point they are probably going to have Swift only APIs in the same way that there are Objective-C only APIs now. And originally, you could write in C if you wanted to. You could write a lot of Mac apps only in C. In the olden days, that's how all of them were written. And over time, Objective-C came in, and there have been Objective-C only APIs. So over time, there will be Swift only APIs eventually. As Apple add new APIs to things, but that hasn't happened yet. And even internally, Swift is still so young that even internally, Apple is hardly using it for anything. So if they can't even work it into their workflow in mass yet, then I think that shows that we're not yet to the level, and we're not close yet to the level where it's a requirement for everybody to use. That being said, I think if you're starting out fresh, if you don't know how to program it, or if you only have a little bit of programming knowledge so far, or Objective-C knowledge so far, and you're looking to expand your knowledge starting now, by all means, do that in Swift. Like I don't think it makes a lot of sense to learn Objective-C from scratch now that Swift is coming up and being the hotness. Although that being said, I think it's very likely that any iOS app you will probably need to know some Objective-C at some point to do something. Similar to how Objective-C programmers generally, like, you can get along pretty well most of the time, but occasionally you have to call a C function, or you'll have to know how C works enough to use some API that is C only. So new programmers should definitely start with Swift, I would say, just because you generally don't want to start with something that is on its way out long term. You want to start with something that is going to be as useful as long as possible.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing is, like, I know enough Swift at this point that I can read it, but I can't write it. Because I was like, often I'll be searching on Stack Overflow and I'll find an answer to something that I was struggling with, and the answer is written in Swift. And so I need to work out how it works. And so at this point, I know it enough to be like, I know it just enough to be like read only, but I could never create it out of nothing. And I think if you're new to something, it's like your goal is probably going to be to learn Swift well enough that you can write your programs in it and program in it, but then know Objective-C at least well enough that you can read it and understand what's going on with all the crazy square brackets and the general kind of structure of it. But that's probably all you'll ever need to actually, in practical use.
Right, exactly. And there are certain things about Swift too. Like it isn't a guarantee that if you like Objective-C that you will like Swift. It is a different style of language. It is not Objective-C with pointers removed. Like that isn't it. It is not like what a lot of people were saying before Swift was unveiled. It was like, oh, just make an Objective-C without the C. And that is even how Apple introduced it on the keynote slide. But that really isn't what it is at all. It really is more like a modern reinterpretation of C++. And so this is going to mesh better with some people than others. For me, honestly, I don't like a lot of it, a lot of what I know of it, at least so far. And again, I haven't used it in a project yet, so this could change as I use it. But a lot of the things that are some of its more advanced features, like generics, I don't think I will ever use most of that stuff. This is going to kind of gel better with some people than others, and that might influence how early you want to jump into it. Because for me, it hasn't done much for me, and it doesn't really appeal to me as strongly as some other changes would have or may have, then I'm in less of a rush. But if you're the kind of person who you enjoy those kind of language features that it's adding, or you enjoy the kind of formalism that it imposes that wasn't there before, then by all means, jump in. But that's not going to be true of everybody, and I think that's okay.
Yeah, and I think I've gradually gotten better about having the Swift guilt of having that feeling of like, oh, I really should be learning this. And it's like the understanding of it's like, at some point, I'm sure it's in my future. I don't know when that is. And it's the role it's going to play in my future is also going to depend on where Apple takes their platforms and what platforms and opportunities make the most sense for my business. Like, I don't know, like iOS is relatively young and it's also relatively old. Like 7 years or so for a platform is getting to a point that you start to wonder, is something new coming along that is going to maybe, sort of overtake it? Because, very few things in technology seem to last more than 10 or 15 years. And so we're at least sort of towards the middle, if not the tail end of this, this wave. And then you sort of keep your eye out for which platform and what opportunity is going to be the next big thing.
Yeah, because as we were saying last week about market opportunities and how you can take advantage of a market that's like on its boom time, and then how quickly that window falls off as it gets more crowded. It's the same thing with languages and with technologies. Like if you can get in relatively early to things. Now, again, this is a balance between like conservatism and stability versus, how cool it is to try new things and whether you're the kind of person who loves just trying new languages for the sake of trying them and or whether you're more kind of product focused like me and David here. But I think there's a similar kind of window with technologies where, like, as I said, like you can tell that this is the beginning of the end of Objective-C, and it's going to be a long way down. It's gonna be here for a while.
Yeah.
We're not talking 5 years. We're talking at least 10 that is still going to be around and still be relevant. I mean, look at how long. I mean, look, I just said C functions still exist that we still call routinely from Objective-C apps, and that those have been there since the beginning of Core Foundation, which was in the late 80s. I mean,
it's going to be at least until Apple replaces their fundamental like OS structure, probably, or something like that. Because like Apple isn't going to rewrite all their apps unless they absolutely have to.
Right, and all the foundation classes. I mean, Swift has its own strings, it has its own arrays, but there's so many things in foundation and networking and I/O and graphics, all these things that Swift is still calling the system Objective-C and C APIs to do those things. So it's not like they threw away the entire stack and the entire API. You're just writing things in a new front-end language. It's not like that whole stack is going to go away in 2 years or 5 years or even 10 years. I think that's unlikely. Anyway, we are sponsored this week by our friends at NS Screencast. NS Screencast features short, focused screencasts on iOS development. Every week, you're going to find a new, fantastically produced episode that will help you build and enhance your development skills. Now, I've been looking at these for this past week since they came to us with this. Have you looked at these two, David?
Yeah.
these are great. The production value on these is really, really high. And what I like about them is that they're short. Like, the idea is it's just one short episode a week, and you just keep up with it, and you can kind of keep up on new technologies, you can learn new things, but it's not, you don't have to jump in and watch like a 45-minute conference video just to keep up with what's going on or to learn something new. It's a nice overview with examples and everything, and the production quality, I think, is great. Have you seen one that you liked?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually, speaking of what we've been talking about, I've been watching a little bit of the ones about Swift just to kind of keep an eye on what's going on there. Because like we said, it's not something that I'm at the level where I want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's really helpful to just be able to sit down and watch a short, like 10, 15-minute video to get a sense of like, what are all these fancy keywords and things I keep hearing people talk about. And so I can sit down and watch, what's new in sort of Swift 2 or Swift optionals, or all the kind of these things that are totally new, and in a very short amount of time, understand what's happening without, sort of sitting there and just going through the documentation myself. And so found that to be really helpful.
You can watch these videos on the web, on iOS, or you can they also have a tvOS app. They're already on the Apple TV. You can watch it right there on the NS Screencast tvOS app. All this costs just $9 a month or $100 a year, with team plans available too. You can get 30% off your first month by signing up at nsscreencast.com/firstcrack. nsscreencast.com/firstcrack. Thank you so much to NS Screencast for supporting this show and all of Relay FM.
All right, and the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly with Swift that I thought would be kind of maybe it's the best way to call it is a thought experiment, is I was recently trying to think through if in the limited amount of time I have to learn something, if I would be better off putting that time and energy into learning Swift and essentially embracing the future of iOS, or diversifying and learning modern Android development. And when I sort of posed that question to myself, the answer immediately wasn't obvious, because I think about it in Swift and I'm like, okay, it's the future of the platform, and that's better. I'm very committed to iOS. That's where I make the majority of my living. But it also means that I'm tied into one basket. Like, I'm putting all of my apps, all my eggs into that one basket. And there's part of me that wonders would I be better off if instead I took that energy of learning something new and put it into learning Android. In the end, I'm skeptical if I actually ever would, because it's so hard to think about developing for a platform that I don't use on a regular basis. But I think my gut says at the end of the day, I would actually probably be more prudent for me to know both iOS and Android than to know iOS and then iOS plus Swift, and sort of as I know it now.
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, obviously, I think you can learn Swift more easily than you can learn Android, because you are still on the same platform, calling into most of the same APIs and everything. So I think Swift would be an easier transition. Also, Swift would eventually replace your Objective-C slot in your mind. So it wouldn't it wouldn't be like an additional thing that you'd have to decide where to spend your time between on an ongoing basis. It would be kind of like a one-time big transition over 6 months or whatever, however long it would take you to really master it and really be doing it full time. But Android, of course, opens up way more market share. I mean, if you have a handful of apps, well, you have more than a handful. But suppose somebody has a normal number of apps on the App Store, and they have to choose whether to convert all their existing apps from Objective-C to Swift or port them to a new platform. Obviously, the right move there would be to port them to a new platform, because the customers don't care what language your app is written in, so you wouldn't get any benefit on the customer side by converting to Swift. It's more of like an investment in your own long-term ongoing education, long-term craft, long-term time savings for yourself, assuming Swift will save you time in the long run, which I think it probably will over time, but we don't know that yet, really. So it's a question. I mean, this is a great thought experiment. This is one of the reasons why I want to do the podcast with you, because you are so good at coming up with these crazy ideas, because it isn't that crazy. Like, if you think about it, going on to a new platform is probably a better idea than relearning the language on the platform you're already on. That being said, if you specialize in one of these areas, if you specialize and you say, I'm going to just be really, really good at making iOS apps, and that way, to do what you do, to be able to try out a whole bunch of ideas, to be able to make new apps quickly and deploy them to the store quickly. If you get really, really good at that one thing, versus if you spread your knowledge out into a more broad tool set, really. So you're able to make iOS apps and Android apps, and maybe apps for something else, maybe Mac apps, maybe web apps. If you spread it out and get more wide like that, I feel like that might be harder for one person to be very productive and very successful for themselves, because there's so much overhead involved in dealing with these different ecosystems, different platforms, different languages, different APIs. I feel like you can be better specializing in one and being able to just really crank out high volume work on one, rather than spreading yourself out very wide to be able to do a wider variety of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think ultimately that's the reality of that's where I am. That's where I have been for the last year and a half, since this would even be sort of a thought experiment that could exist. Is ultimately, for me and my business to run, I have to be extraordinarily productive in one thing, and to be a true expert and be able to really, if I have an idea for an app, to be able to build it very quickly. And for me right now, that's writing, iOS apps in Objective-C. Like, that's something that I can really crank out just by the virtue of having so much experience in it. And I think until such time as doing that thing, having that expertise and having that sort of finely honed of a skill ceases to be the thing that I need to do. And it becomes like, okay, now I need to diversify. I need to go somewhere else. Like, it isn't working on iOS anymore. That's probably where I'll continue to go. But in this, it's for the same reasons that I haven't learned Swift is probably the same reasons that I haven't learned Android. It's that same thing of, it's like, I like, and it seems to work well, to be a true master of one thing and to drive that, sort of drive and perfect your art and craft of doing that one thing is probably better than becoming a complete generalist, but being sort of some more superficial in all the different areas. And this is obviously certainly coming from the perspective of being independent. Like, if you work in a bigger company, you may have to be a generalist and be working in all these different platforms and areas because that's just what your boss tells you to do. But because my boss doesn't tell me to do anything, I can be able to just sort of go with whatever makes sense for me.
Right, and I think it makes sense for big companies to diversify, because when you look at the way big companies structure their engineering departments, you don't usually have one person who's in charge of 5 different platforms of apps, and they're the only ones working on them. Usually, you have employees who are specialized, and so the whole department might be able to be more broad and have an app for iOS and an app for Android, and even look at Windows Phone or BlackBerry or whatever else comes along. But each individual person, to maximize their efficiency, is usually only doing one of those things. It makes sense for companies to be able to afford to be more broad, but for individuals to maximize what you can do, I think it makes the most sense for individuals to be specialized.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where we're just going to end up for today's discussion. That I think Swift is a powerful, useful tool that I'm glad exists, and I'm glad Apple is pushing the platform forward on, but I don't expect to use it anytime soon.
I'm sure both of us will use it eventually, and it might even be faster than we think. It might even be like next year, but I'm certainly not in any rush to start doing it right now. But that's fine.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where we'll end it for today.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Please tell your friends about the show, help us spread the word, recommend us on Overcast, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.